Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Planning Commission podcast. Today's episode about those planning models with Professor Sybil Derrible, University of Illinois, Chicago.
The Planning Commission podcast is a discussion you never even knew you needed. Sit back, join us for a conversation between a couple of old friends and their guests to talk about all the things that are happening in this wide-ranging profession called planning. Our views are our own and don't reflect those of any national planning organizations or any particular public agencies and only belong to us. So read your commission packet, know your Robert's rules, and enjoy this, the Planning Commission podcast.
Let's take roll. Commissioner Minshaw.
Isn't unaccounted for.
Okay. And Commissioner Kostelik?
Accounted for, but loosely present.
Okay. And I am here. Today's agenda is our discussion item, our whiskey pairing, our interview, and our lightning round. Commissioners, can I get a motion to approve?
So moved.
And second.
All right. So to our audience, just a reminder, you can find all our past meetings on our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Head over to YouTube, Apple, and Amazon. Please subscribe, like, and give us some feedback. Hit us up with an email, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. All right. Today's episode. Man, I think this is going to be a good one. I'm excited about this because I think that every now and then I know one of the premises and purposes of this podcast is to challenge our own profession, to think about how we can do things better, how we can either shake things up, shed old ways, adopt new ways, whatever that might mean, and just basically be a better profession for ultimately the people that we serve in whatever capacity that could mean. And I think we're going to have a good discussion on that momentarily. So to my fellow commissioners, our discussion item question is, can planning be planning without the premise of growth? I want to think about that for just a second, because when we think about what types of planning do we do, right? Strategic planning, environmental planning, land use planning. Maybe we're thinking about revitalization, but you could probably make an argument, man, every one of those has to do with growth. It's either we have growth happening and we have to account for it and accommodate it, and in some places, I know we've gone after some project, there's no growth, and the whole intent is how do we get things to grow, right? And in a meaningful way, or how do we protect ourselves from growth in maybe environmental planning? So are we capable of doing that? Of doing big planning ideas and whether they be long range plans or what have you, without the topic of growth? Any thoughts on that?
Back when I was an adjunct professor and teaching a planning course for a public affairs program, I did a segment on that, simply challenging them. And I had them read a book about Detroit and talking about what's it like to be a planner in a place where you've got a history of decline, and what does that look like in the future, looking at your demographics and things. But it's something that I think, at least in the United States, most planning professions would not be accustomed to doing. But I was looking up just what some of our metro areas that do have declining populations, because I think even like a city, maybe a Detroit or a St. Louis, where the city's experienced decline, the region has continued to grow. But even looking like metro area decreases, Panama City, Florida had a 14% population decrease over a 5-year period of time. Chico, California, Fairbanks, Alaska, usually some smaller metros and things, but it is happening out there.
So kind of a random thought, but I guess it depends on what you say by growth. I mean, you're assuming population growth, but if there is a community that isn't growing by people, but their growth they want is either income based or tax based or just growth of culture, that doesn't have to assume that it's more people. It could make the assumption that instead you're wanting to redesign and reinvest in current communities and figure out what is currently there and what could be, but it doesn't actually mean more people. The other just general thought is, especially for those us here in the Northwest, I think we're kind of on the cusp where a lot of us are starting to talk about how do you plan to try to reduce the pace of growth, right? Because it's gotten so far ahead of us that sometimes you have to plan for things are going to cost more to develop, or we want a different standard, which part of that result could be growth slows down. We're just so reactionary to growth that that's all a lot of us know is to plan for growth. But in some places like where we are, it's been too much growth, right? And so you haven't had the ability to focus on quality than just quantity of people and how to react. So sometimes it takes a lot of self-control to kind of step back and say, maybe it's not about always attracting, responding to growth, but what kind of growth and how do we maybe slow it down so it's more quantitative?
And I think probably other facets of how we do that too, of like you said, there's population growth, but how much of maybe a decline is due to changes in birth rates, and what does that do to average household occupancy, average household trip generation, all these other things that have kind of fundamentally gone into planning projections almost unchecked for decades. Are we needing to recheck that? So that's kind of a question, a topic I think for our guest today. I'd love to hear the perspective.
Well, and I got news for y'all. We better figure this out, because if you follow any kind of demographic information, you know, China is seeing this now. They are starting to shrink. And it's because of obviously the one child policy. So internationally, there's a massive effect. The economic impact of that is tremendous, and they have to figure that out. Our guest today was part of a paper that is significant, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, but talked about half the cities in this country, of bigger cities in this country, maybe facing that sort of thing. We've seen, varying statistics. I saw one just the other day that said something equivalent of like, so I think it was 30% of American women over the age of 30 are without a child, which was at like kind of an all-time high. And like, wow, there's another piece of it. I'll ask just one last thing. I cut my teeth in the planning profession with a person who owned a small firm, boutique firm, and was known for doing demographic reports. And once I got in there and saw how that sausage making happened, I was like, I got questions, because you're showing growth rates for cities that have not seen anything in decades. And yet his response to me was kind of like, well, they don't want to see, just stagnation. They want to see that there's going to be some hope there. And I'm going, well, really? Is that accurate? And so maybe I was being too naive in a way, I guess. But nevertheless, it is a hard thing. So whether we can or can't, we darn sure better learn how to, and maybe get into the next level of making our places stronger, and that social cohesiveness, and what the next rung of the ladder for planning is in the future. So
I think
that's
you
the
should
kind
give
of
another
stuff.
little snippet on that demographic work you were doing, because you didn't touch the surface of what that entailed.
Yeah, I'll just the one of my career highlights slash lowlights was being a brand new planner into the actual industry, and being handed a topographical map, of like a USGS map of all things, with a red pen, driving around the back roads of northern Idaho, and being told, hey, there's a house, there's a house, there's a house, and putting red dots on a map. And as if that was the official way of doing a count. And I'm just going, are you serious? Is this how we're doing this?
Counting
And I'm going,
mailboxes
right.
and
And I'm like, at least give me an aerial map where I can kind of get a head start on seeing some rooftops. But I'm looking at, the topography of hills, and like, this is just insane to me. but daddy got to pay the bills. So anyway, all right. We're going to change things up a little bit in our batting order, because our guest is going to do our whiskey pairing momentarily. But before we do that, we would like to take a quick moment to thank our friends at Plan Edison for supporting today's podcast. If you're looking to sharpen your urban planning skills and advance your urban planning career, head on over to Plan Edison Courses, which offers over 300 courses on cutting edge planning topics. And I hope this is one of them, right? And skills such as parking reform, missing middle housing, equity analysis, and climate resilience. Visit courses.planedison.com/PC10 to take advantage of an exclusive offer for Planning Commission podcast listeners. So let's turn our attention to our guest. Our guest today is Professor Sybil Derrible at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And Sybil, you're going to hit, first of all, thank you for joining our show. We appreciate you doing so.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you.
All right. You are going to hand the audience the whiskey today, or at least our drink. Go ahead. Tell us what you have in mind based on your background and everything that's sort of germane to you.
No, absolutely. Well, I should say, by the way, that I love this idea, right? Pairing a topic like a drink with the topic. I think it's amazing. And I knew it was whiskey. It was like, I was thinking about the whiskeys and I just couldn't find the right one. Then it hit me. I don't think it should be whiskey. I think it should be pastis. So I'm French. Pastis is a big thing in France. And when I grew up, it was really the thing that especially adults and especially older adults would get together and have a pastis, on Sunday or in the evening or something. And as we're talking about depopulation, a lot of the times when a city is depopulating, it's the more senior people who are staying around. So I thought, well, if we want to pair depopulation with a drink, it should probably be pastis because, I mean, that's what a lot of the, at least when I grew up, the more elderly, the grandparents would drink. So I thought that would be great. It is kind of a weird drink. It is licorice. It's something you have to get used to, and it's all around the Mediterranean. You have countries, almost all countries have a version of it. So you have ouzo in Greece, raki in Turkey, Iraq, and a lot of the Middle East there as well. But I think it's delicious. So the way you're normally supposed to drink it is you put a little bit of it. I want to say kind of like I don't know what's the like a highball, when you put like whiskey and a bit of sparkling water. There would just be a bit of a pastis and then a lot of water. Personally, I just like to drink it on the rocks. So it's much stronger. I do put a lot of ice, unlike whiskey when you really don't put much because you want to keep the flavor. With pastis, I do put a lot of ice, especially in the summer, and I just love it. So there we go. That's my idea for a pairing.
Oh man, I love it. And the older I get, the more I am drawn to the idea of being an old dude with a drink sitting around talking. I'm all about that. Let's do it. I love it.
I think I'm gonna have to make a run out and try to find some in our area. I was also, as you suggested it, I was reading on it. It does have a higher alcohol content than a lot of traditional liqueurs and things. So where we're used to that being maybe a mixer or something else, this seems to stand up on its own. So
very good. All right, let's turn our attention to you, your extensive research and background. Tell our audience, first of all, who the heck are you and where you've come from, how you've gotten to where you are, and just a bit of your journey on this planning related sort of discussion.
No, absolutely. And where I'm from, I think is going to be the most interesting part of this entire show. I'm French, born and raised in France, French citizen, except that I was not born and raised in mainland France. So I don't know how many people know this, but France has tons of islands all over the world. Got some beautiful islands in the Caribbean, beautiful islands in the Indian Ocean, beautiful islands in the Pacific Ocean. And it's got a tiny bit of, tiny island or a small archipelago left just off the coast of Newfoundland. So they're on the east coast of the US and Canada. 6,000 people. It's called Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, for really two cities, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon. That's where I'm from. Was born and raised there. Very strong French culture, but also very influenced by North America, by the US and Canada. I always tell people I learned English by watching TV. I was an addict to Seinfeld when I grew up, so there's anything wrong with it, but that's how I learned English. And yeah, that's where I'm from. So growing up there, I know exactly where the water comes from. I know exactly how we produce electricity. I know where waste goes. I know how wastewater is handled. I even know telecom, how we get the access to the internet. And so I was really thinking about all those infrastructure systems as integrated, right? Integrated system. They're integrated. They're interdependent. They're interconnected. All those words. And so when so after high school, I had to leave. I had to go away for my studies because we don't have any universities. I ended up going to England just because it was back in the good old days when England was part of Europe. And so I was paying European fees, so home fees, but I wanted to have an English speaking education. And when I was there in engineering for my undergrad, I got to learn about sustainability, and it really struck a chord with me. How do we enable a livable lifestyle? How do we have people going about on their daily basis in a way that doesn't require so much energy that the earth, cannot provide? And so when you put these things together, all those infrastructure systems and sustainability together, that's basically all I'm doing, right? And because I really think that the way that infrastructure systems are planned, designed, operated, maintained now is not integrated enough. And I really think that this is one of the things that we should be much better at. Actually, planners are probably much better at it than engineers, because engineers get too specialized too early. But that's what I do. So I was in England, and I got my PhD in Canada. But I've been in Chicago for the past 12 years. Absolutely love being at UIC, at the University of Illinois Chicago. And yeah, there you go. I think I answered the question.
I
There
think
you
you
go.
kind of said that planners tend to just yada, yada, yada the rest with that.
Not at all. And I actually know I love planners, and one of my biggest messages is really to try to have those two communities that don't really like each other, like planners and engineers, actually talk more, Because engineers are annoying. I get it. Planners don't like engineers because we're just, we want numbers and we're very narrow in how we think. But planners they just ramble all the time. They're not, they're very vague in the ideas. Nothing can be simple, right? So I think we have to start a real conversation to work together, because I think that's the only way that we're gonna, get it done. So partly for depopulation, we're going to talk about now, but also for sustainability in the future, and just increase the livability of cities.
So your yada, 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 on your bio of those issues include things like infrastructure planning, design, data science, AI, environmental justice, future studies of infrastructure, livability, sustainability, all the words that we as planners love to talk about. But your title intrigued me because it's Director of Complex and Sustainable Urban Networks Laboratory. But then it says your work is at the nexus of all those yada yadas with urban metabolism. That was a new term for me. So tell me what urban metabolism means and how it's related to the other topics.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's really central to what I do. Before talking about urban metabolism, you can think of metabolism. So metabolism is for human beings, is you eat something or you have sun on you, and how the body processes all these external inputs, and then how you eliminate it once you're done. And so urban metabolism is the same idea of metabolism for the city. So think about all the materials that we import in the city, all the food, everything that we're doing within the city. And so we're talking about materials, we're talking about food, we're talking about water, we're talking about electricity, we're talking about just about everything, right? So it's that interconnections, back to my interconnections of infrastructure, that's where urban metabolism is. So trying to get a picture of how a city functions.
So you had a book come out that started to address this. It came out late in 2020, so it might have got wrapped up in all the COVID stuff. What I love about it, Urban Infrastructure Reflections for 2100, you priced it at $21 for 2100, and then you priced the ebook at $14.52, which is for Chris Danley and myself, and hailing from Vitruvian Planning, you made it Leonardo da Vinci's birth year.
Wow,
So
you
give
noticed
us
that. Wow.
yeah, give us some insight on that book, how it relates to urban metabolism, how you got that idea.
Yeah, so I got that idea for that book. I love that book. I was speaking with a colleague, and we actually were speaking with a glass of wine, as normal. A lot of good ideas come with some wine or some alcohol. But he was telling me about the book Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. I don't know if you've heard of the book. It's a fun book. It's a lot of short accounts, so it's a hypothetical account of Marco Polo when he traveled around Asia, but they're not real cities. And I really like the fact that through the stories, Marco Polo was talking about infrastructure, but also about the people. And I thought, let's try to do something, because what we do in academia is to write those very serious papers. Let's try to ask those experts who are incredibly talented. They probably yearn to do something a bit more creative. Let's ask them to just write reflections. So they can do whatever they want. It can be a short story, a poem, an essay, a perspective piece, an art piece, absolutely whatever they want. We'll put it into a book We didn't want to go through a publisher because we would have had probably to change the format. And so we just went with Amazon. And then when we're thinking about the price, it was like, well, it's 2,100, so $21 kind of makes sense, not expensive. And then for the ebook, the last thing I wanted was to have a rational economic model or whatever decision for the price. So it's like, let's make it fun. And Da Vinci being one of the, I'm going to say engineer, but like an amazing engineer or architect or scientist or everything planner. Again, his birth year, we just picked that for the ebook. So nothing rational about it, and I love it.
Well, you said something at the beginning that I think for those that maybe aren't as familiar with the professor world, you started with a book of your own that you liked, which I know professors that look back at books like, nah, I really didn't like that one. So I think that stood out. Yeah, so give us a little bit more. What's the key point of that? What are some key findings?
Well, I mean, so there's that book, right, that we did. What I liked about the book is that I was thinking about a short story. So I decided to write a short story of a kid in 2100 going about in Saint Pierre and Miquelon. And I liked it a lot because it forced me to think about infrastructure, not in the context of providing something for people, but how one person, how the life of a person is framed often around the infrastructure that's there and the infrastructure that's not there, right? And so that's what I try to do, is to try to think more about people and the external context that are going to shape. So those people shape infrastructure, and infrastructure shapes them. So it's the same thing here for the study that came out recently about depopulation. Is we're looking at those major trends that actually have a huge impact on cities in the US, but also in many parts of the world. One of them is sustainability. We've talked about them. One of them is all those man-made or natural disasters and threats. And one of them is depopulation, right? So we know that the global population will decrease at some point, probably before the end of the century. So right now we're at 8 billion. At some point we'll be at 10 billion, maybe around 2070 or something, and then it's going to go down. In the US, probably something similar until 2080. The whole population is going to increase at some point, it will go down. But before that, a lot of cities will depopulate. So before the population of the US starts to decrease, many people, you have a lot of internal migration, and immigration is not even, it goes everywhere, right? And so when you think about all those cities that are depopulating, and that's happening in Illinois, so that's actually why at first I was really thinking about depopulation, is that we have many cities in Illinois that are depopulating. What do we do, right? Now we have people who are there, the revenue base is shrinking. They have a lot of infrastructure that's there, and the way that we build infrastructure is in such a way that it's very hard to maintain, and it's also very hard to separate parts of it, right? You can't just shut down a part of a water network. The whole thing has to keep working while the city is depopulating. And so we thought, before we even think about some of the solutions, let's try to see the extent of the problem. Is it really just an Illinois problem, or is it a US problem? So that's where we did those projections. We took 2 other data sets that are there that happen at different, what we say, granularity. So one's at the county level and the other one's at the grid level. And we merged them, and then we downscaled, and we came up with a method to come up with an estimation of the population in every US city, so about 30,000 of them by 2100. And what we find is that depopulation is not at all an isolated problem. It is a nationwide problem. Every single state will be impacted, maybe except Hawaii. I don't know why Hawaii seems to be doing okay, but every single state will be impacted. And our goal is not to go and point figures at individual cities and tell them whether you'd better do something, otherwise you're going to depopulate. The goal was to say, look, it's a problem, and it's not just an Illinois problem or an Idaho problem or a Washington problem. We should really rethink how the way we do things. We should really rethink the way that we plan and design infrastructure, because this is happening. And I think the message is working because you've invited me. So thank you.
Well, we like people who stir the pot a little bit, and I'm sure that I know it's, having read some of the feedback about some of your research, there was a little bit of that as well. And I'm struck, I was recently doing project work in Sacramento. And while, yes, there's still conventional growth that's occurring in that region, there are definitely parts of the city that are not seeing that growth, and it's going the other way around. And getting into a real micro topic, if you will, on this big macro topic, I'm of the mindset that one of the areas that needs to really quickly change is the American Fire Code. And I say that because we have a whole bunch of structures all across this country, mostly coming from the commercial retail sector, but now office as well, that are starting to be vacant or have been vacant for some time. And you're kind of looking at these buildings going, this could be ready made for housing, because we know we need that. But but that fire code is often very prohibitive in terms of the reuse, and you don't want to just tear it out. You can't just tear everything down. The cost and the environmental toll of that is significant, but it gets to your point. We're here. You're pointing out entire cities that are shrinking, and we have a lot of American cities. While the numbers might seem like they're expanding, there might be neighborhood portions that are actually contracting, right? And so we are there in many instances. I wanted to ask you, if there are any general themes or takeaways that you can identify that are happening now that might be regional, that people aren't necessarily thinking about. What's going on in the American Northeast, the South. We know the Midwest and the Rust Belt area. That's been a long topic of this, and the contraction that's occurring, and people mostly moving either to the Sunshine States or out west or whatever. But your research was, you're elbow deep in it. Give us a sense of what's going on, maybe regionally a little bit.
Absolutely. And I'll preface it by saying, I don't believe the trends that we find until 2100, just because it's too far away. So any model, when you go that far away, you know you're wrong. What we find right now, and it's really because of the two models that we use, that we merged, they replicate some of the tendencies that are happening now, which is the South tends to have more people, an increase in population, as well as the West, right? So places like Texas, for example, we see that they're not suffering maybe as much, maybe, at least, many cities will depopulate, but the Texas, might have a higher population because of the trends that have been happening in the past 20 years. But I don't think that's going to be the case in the future. So that's why I want to be careful, right? So what we see is the West is going to be a little bit better off in the South, maybe, than the Midwest and the Northeast. Maybe we do take into account climate change to some impact, but with sea level rise, who knows what's going to happen? Maybe more people will move to the Midwest. We don't know that. It's again all back to the modeling, and you were talking about that before, right? How do you come up with those estimates? So sometimes you pull numbers out of the hat, which is usually not the right way to do things.
A hat. That's one word.
It is. But another way is to look at the trends that have been happening in the past, 10, 20 years, and to just assume that they will stick in the future. So that's what we're sort of doing here now. And so, but I really want to caution that it's not an isolated problem. And even before, by the way, we're talking about, well, what about all those places that are actually gaining population? What do we want to do about that? Just know that the likelihood that one of those places in 50 years will actually depopulate is very high, right? Mm-hmm. So when you plan for the growth of those places, try to think about the infrastructure there when it was going to become a liability in 50 years and how it will be decommissioned, right? Because it will happen. And if it's not the burden of the people now, because those places are increasing, they will probably depopulate at some point.
So I have a follow-up question for you. So thinking about that, a lot of what you're talking about is data and modeling. And for those of us who are wonks, you can interpret data in lots of ways based upon what your assumptions are. And unfortunately, a lot of times what your preconceived outcomes are of the truth. So what are questions that those of us in these professions as planners or engineers should be asking of those who both collect data and will review data, right? So, I mean, I'm not saying there's necessarily good data or bad data, but when you're looking at it, what are those critical questions and maybe challenging questions that you should ask before you start making conclusions from it?
So that's a very, very good question. One of the people so when I was doing my PhD, one of my committee members always said, a model is just one voice around the table. So don't take, an output from a model as face value. It is making some assumptions.
We like that, but we deal with it all the time with transportation, right? Because we joke, the model made us do it. Yep. That happens way more than any of us want to admit.
Yep, absolutely. But it should be just one voice around the table. So you want to be careful with what the model tell you. You still want to, believe some of it, right? But it's one voice around the table. So you want to be careful. And then there was something else, but I just forgot now. Which is, it's going to get, I don't know, I'll think about it again after. But we do a lot of modeling, but you have to be, a little bit careful. So you want to like it, but you want to can be a little bit careful. It's kind of like pundits, by the way. I just read that recently, that when you listen to a show and there's pundits, maybe like me, when we make forecasts, we know so much about few things of a system that we tend to over exaggerate the things that we know. And so even sometimes my forecast, especially when I just try to talk them out, right, without a model, might be actually worse than what a random person think, because I'll over exaggerate some bits.
So
Wow.
but when it comes back to questions, like, so those of us who see that data, whether it's yours or others, how would you, suggest for us to even think about what the right questions are to ask? I mean, how do we think about it critically?
Questions to the modelers?
Well, right, like questions of the data. I mean, how do we know, is it good data?
Or I think of like your one voice around the table. Well, the model, it's science, engineering is truth. I think it leads to others around the table maybe being reluctant to bring another voice and other considerations.
Yeah, so actually, and I remember what I wanted to say, and someone told me that last year, and I love it. Is also there's the saying, you can't manage what you can't measure, but when you do that, you end up only managing what you can measure, right? And so especially as planners, you should say, you know what, I love your model, I think it's great. This is telling us this, but your model, the inputs are limited, and there's so much more that goes into this. So you look at the insights that the model gave you, and maybe you question a lot of the inputs that are there, and you try to especially identify what's not being measured, what's not being modeled. And so when you make a decision, you're like, you know what? Didn't think about the model, didn't take into account on this perspective, this perspective. And so I'm going to take what the model gives me, but I'm going to tweak it because this is not there. And then it's more of a consensus between what you think and what the model thinks, as opposed to just blindly accepting what the model tells you.
So where we kind of end up, you look at a demographic section or something of a plan, and it's almost all exclusively because it's all we have is the census. How do we go beyond that? How do we just, again, make the census a person at the table? What are the other ways? How is technology changing that? What do you foresee coming in terms of better ways to incorporate and analyze demographics rather than just doing a snapshot or a plot summary of what the latest census data told us?
That's a great question. That's an amazing question. I don't have an answer for that. I don't have an answer for you. I do think that, and you're planners, so you're not faulty of this. I am as an engineer, is that we don't talk to the communities enough. So the census gives us one thing, but the community is going to tell us something else. They're going to tell us maybe what their worries are. From an engineering point of view, what I would do is I assume someone's going to know the problem. Let's say, for example, a city, and they're going to come to me and they say, well, we need to build a new road. Where should we put it? You do your model, you tell us. And really the engineer, instead of just accepting what the city is saying, should say, well, let's actually go and talk to the community, and let's see if that's really what their main problem. And I'm saying that because there's a quote I like a lot by Don Norman, who wrote the book called the Design of Everyday Life. And his quote is, engineers and business people are problem solvers. Designers are problem discoverers. The wrong solution or a problem to the wrong, a solution to the wrong problem can be worse than no solution at all. Solve the correct problem. And identifying what the correct problem is really not that easy. Really not that easy, right? When I remember talking with some transportation people here, and they're telling me, if you really want to solve the traffic problem, if you really want to solve it, invest massively in schools. Because one of the main reasons why people go to the suburbs is because the schools are better in the suburbs, right? So the main problem is that not that we don't have enough roads. And believe me, in the US, we have enough roads. We definitely have enough roads. So the problem is not that we don't have enough roads, is that why are people traveling in the first place, right? And so, switching that a little bit, I think might help. That's what I would do as an engineer. Oh, that's where I would like the engineering profession to move. But you're already probably doing that.
Well, I think what you said, and it resonates with us because it's what we do. Ask what the story is behind the data and what it's telling us. And especially if we're working in smaller towns, and when you get down into it, the margins of error are so great on those things that if you're using it for this hard line policy decision making without asking the question, what's behind that? Is it even true of what our local population thinks or experiences? That's where we kind of come into that of just use it as a starting point, or like I love what you said, just one voice around the table. Chris?
Yeah, just laughing because Don and I just worked in a community where there's essentially a rural community, small town, and there's this concept of being of a pathway, but everybody wanted to call it a class 4 bikeway, which simply means it's separated from the road a bit, two directional, and so forth. But there are certain requirements and thoughts that you need to exercise out in order to choose that the right one. And so certain people, oh, it can't be that, can't be that, can't be that. And ultimately, we just said, well, then just call it a multi-use path. And basically, it's the same exact facility, but you're getting to your point of just like, are we solving the right problem? Instead of having to go after this one way and this one definition, and it has to be this and it has to be that, like, change the definition. Just call it something else, and voila, we've solved pretty much all of the problems. There's still some engineering type of things that have to be considered and so forth, but sometimes we just get so hung up on, it has to be this one way. I want to switch gears a little bit. And then I think after this question, maybe we'll have a little bit of a dialogue, because I know you wanted to maybe ask us a question and just have some discussion about social fabric and so on. But you are, also in the world of artificial intelligence a bit, AI.
Mhm.
That's something we've not talked about on this podcast just yet. And I think we'd be foolish to think that as a profession, we are bulletproof from the effects of AI. And obviously, I would imagine it's going to be one of those topics that's discussed more in planning schools for its benefits, hopefully, and making certain decisions or gathering information or whatever the case may be. I'm wondering if you could just shed some light on that and give our audience and even us, school us a little bit about maybe what's coming in that way, and that we ought to be aware of.
That's a very good question. I can even tell you about one of the projects that I'm working on right now with one of my students. It's actually, the idea came from the student, not even me. But what the student did was to get satellite views of intersections in Chicago. And then we know which intersections had a lot of crashes and which didn't. So which ones were safer and which ones were less safe. And then we could actually have AI learn what are the properties, the features in those safe areas that make them safe and that are not in unsafe areas. And so ideally in the future, think about, you want to do an intersection. Right now as the planner, you would come up with something, but with generative AI, you could even have a computer just say, all right, give me a better intersection that's safer. And then you'll get the plans and you get everything done. And the AI, the way it will work is we'll look at, again, intersections that were safe, and it's just going to come up with something. And that's, again, where I will say, well, you look at it and you say, well, this makes sense. I'll take this feature, this one. I'm not going to take everything for face value, because if there's a model, it's just one voice on the table. But I think it will make you either more creative. Instead of applying always the same solutions, it's going to be a different voice from a different type of expert that's incredibly cheap because it's AI. But I think it's coming, and I think it's going to probably have a big impact. I can think, so in traffic safety is one. The other one, my favorite infrastructure of all time, it's green infrastructure. Because with green infrastructure, so this is where you have low impact development, green infrastructure. So stormwater management, instead of having just a grate to go to the sewers, you have permeable pavers, or some type of a rain garden or a bioswale. And so when you do that, you're handling stormwater, but usually that green also helps lower the ambient air temperature. Maybe usually it also increases well-being. It might be good for economic development. And but there's a lot of variables. And so maybe AI, especially for smaller cities that don't necessarily have the engineers or the resources to do a lot of that modeling work, maybe AI could help to offer one design that can then be tweaked. So I think it's going to be amazing when used properly.
Sybil, all I heard you say was that AI may very well put traffic engineers out of business, and I immediately fell in love with you. So we're good. That's good.
I'm not going to disagree. I'm not the biggest fan of traffic engineer myself.
Well, you just immediately raised up our collective professions that said the planners may very well have the final say over a really solid design that comes from AI as opposed to the other way around, and us pontificating and the engineers going, heck no, it's never going to work. So done, man. Let's bring on the AI. Sabrina?
Chris has just redefined the hierarchy of planning for communities. So thinking about that though, how much should a community really resolve on or lean on or expect that as they're planning their future or designing their future, we're looking at data and growth forecasts versus how are we building a strong social fabric for what is now and how are we planning for that? I mean, that really is that kind of facts versus inquisitive what's there as a fabric. And maybe
Yeah.
that's a way to tee off the questions you wanted for us.
Well, it is. I mean, because I'll tell you, the more I evolve, the more I see that we already have many technologies. And the biggest hurdle to, I think, improving the livability of communities is not technological. And somehow people are addicted to technologies, right? I always have, students or people coming into me and say, "Oh, have you heard about this technology? It's probably going to solve everything." It's like, no, it's not. Remember that the technology is just supposed to be a support for communities, right? It's just supposed to be a support for us. A story that I learned recently and that I absolutely love. I mean, it's a tragic story, but I love the outcome, which is in Chicago in the 1980s, I think 1996, there was a very, very dramatic heat wave that ended up, I think it's about 800, 700 or 800 people ended up dying because of the heat wave. And then the municipality came up with lots of ways that it wouldn't happen again. And a lot of it was relied on infrastructure, like moving people to stadiums, etc. But a social scientist, a few years after, actually looked at the data, where the people who died, where they were, how they lived, and what that person found, and there's a book about it, was that the biggest problem was loneliness. There were older people, no one was checking on them. It was not an infrastructure problem; it was a social fabric problem. And that's where I would like the engineering community to move is how do we build infrastructure not just to solve a technical problem, but to enhance the social fabric, right? That's really where I hope the community will go. And it will not go there if we don't talk with communities, if you don't talk with planners, if we don't work together. I mean, in the end of the day, we want the same thing. We want the same thing, right? But engineers, I think we get carried away by the technical problems.
Well, for those of you, I think we all perked up when you said the loneliness piece because listeners can go back a few episodes with Jennifer Kent at the University of Sydney in Australia, where we talked about the loneliness factor of that and what's coming into that. So you had questions for us. I like this, bringing some things for us. We're going to have to ask that of future guests, but more for a discussion point. Go ahead with it.
No, absolutely. So I'm an engineer and I'm a professor. I tend to be in my office. I speak with students. I speak with some communities, but I don't actually do any of the things that I'm talking about. But you actually see the real problems, right? You talk with people, you implement solutions. So based on this idea of depopulation, based on those ideas of future infrastructure, what do you think should happen? I mean, how do we get things to change, both, especially, getting engineers to change, but also even the regulations from the state, from the federal government? How do we get it? What do you think should happen? It's a very open question. And I think we have about 3 hours in front of us.
Yeah. Well, I would start with one because I think it kind of resonated with you a little. If you're not familiar with the state of Utah, and really going back to some fascinating stuff about Mormon town planning, they have these streets with massively wide rights of way. I mean, literally a right of way on a residential street that's probably wider than any surface street in Chicago. And so as a result, they've got an infrastructure burden in so many of these cities because of that, from a stormwater perspective, even just down to a tax perspective of a percentage of their land sucked up by right of way. And even being able to go back in and repurpose that. And we have a lot of these small towns in Idaho and Utah that aren't growing. And even the prospect of talking about making a sidewalk gap completion is completely usurped because of this massive amount of infrastructure that their forefathers gave them. We've got no programs, no funding, no policies to go back in and rip out some of that, turn it into more, sustainable infrastructure for stormwater and things like that. So I think that's a spot from the overall policy and practice piece. You could probably do some modeling of what that's costing them from a life cycle standpoint. And this one-time investment would relieve them of this burden while allowing them to do more. But we're still stuck in a framework and a mindset of, well, we must march forward, we must do this, our funding for resurfacing streets. None of that accounts for the context of the place and a stagnant population.
Yeah. Man, what a question. Where I am in the over the last, especially the last few years, having the good fortune of working in, I think it's 5 or 6 different states and lots of different cities, and seeing some common themes and going, man, they're common because the rules are the same. The rules are largely plug and play throughout all of our cities, counties. It's the states vary, but there's a lot of just copycat. And guess what, man? The results are very much the same. So I see it as we have these 2 major elements of our society that's coming to a head. There is we're going to drive everywhere. We're going to go right into our garage. We're not going to see our neighbors. We just want to be hyper efficient, A to B. I don't want to even get out of my car to get a 2,000 calorie donut. It's just the way it's going to be. And that's the life that many people default to, whether they prefer it or not, a different question, but there's that. There's also now we're to the point where we're strapping goggles on our face and we're taking ourselves out of the reality world and into a different reality world. And because for whatever reason, we yearn to be there. Then there's this other place. And you described it with the whiskey pairing drink, a human desire to be elbow to elbow with people, have something, in this case, a drink, tell good stories and get to know one another. And I'm seeing that all over the place about people just going, man, I just want to be around other people. And we're seeing that in various forms, whether it's land use planning, where that's environmental justice discussion and saying we need to blend more. We're seeing it in certain instances of subdivisions that come along once in a while that do have a focus on community spaces and gathering places, and in some cases flat out communal living, where there's, instead of everybody having their own big kitchen, we're going to congregate in one place. See that kind of stuff out there. So I see we're in some ways kind of at loggerheads, and I hope that the second version wins out, because I think that if that version wins out, we will be stronger. People will get together and care for one another a little bit more, and maybe not be kind of, at each other a little bit through their phones, through social media, all the things that we're seeing. Because if that other way wins, I'm scared. I'm scared that we're going to be more isolated, more angry, more upset, and just, it's all about me. And we only have so much time, and I just I'd love to see a result that's very different when everybody's telling us so much of those same common themes of, I just want to interact with other people. I want to walk my neighborhood, but I need places to do it. I need facilities to do it on, and that sort of thing. So I really hope that the humanity side of planning rises to the top.
So, Chris, my thoughts were almost the same. I guess I'll just kind of summarize them a bit more. That I would hope from the planning profession, and I guess maybe just the community development professions, that we find a way to normalize, to expect planning and design to actually start with harder questions, right? To start with, what are we trying to solve? Are we assuming something's a problem? You think about, transportation design even, right? So congestion, we assume congestion's a problem, right? But congestion is what drives very often to different modes and different land use changes. So congestion could also be considering it being a thriving downtown. Is congestion bad when it's downtown and the roads are busy? No, it's a definition of success too. So just, I guess, normalizing to ask a lot of those hard questions. And then I also want to go back to, I think there's a little bit of irony because we started these conversations, Sybil, with, what does demographics and data tell us and what's the future going to be? But then our conversation's more about if really those are the things that gets measured, and that's what tangible is to us, how do we measure or make tangible when we have defined what maybe the actual problems are? Those issues like loneliness and community connection and people scale of what people want. Those aren't easy things to measure. It's hard to measure emotion. It's hard to measure, behaviors. It's easier to have it be about facts and numbers, right? So how do we make a case when it's not just about those numbers?
So what do you need as planners? Because you've got the vision, you've got it right. If you could have, something done, either, I mean, I don't know, what do you need?
For me, I would, first of all, and maybe it is because the social scientist side of me says you've got to have a way to measure things that we currently think are intangible, or at least have a way to talk about it, right? So if you're doing that, how do you compete with an engineer who's saying you got to have this much width, you got to have this much, here's our demand for the roads. And then as planners, we're saying, yeah, but people really want a place to sit nearby. And how close do you make that with lots of trees? Right. And they're saying, well, we have proof that you can only put trees so far back because the vehicle will do X. That's a hard dialogue to have without having an agreed upon way to even talk about those concepts. So for me, that's how do we have people like yourself help us quantify things that are so philosophical?
Well, I look at it, what do we need? I think we need decision makers at all levels to have a basic understanding of this and realize the outcomes and the decisions can be different. We don't have to follow this paradigm. And it's one of these things, I think, in planning, at best, a decision maker that you're going to get might be a mayor or a city council member that's at that level. But try talking this to a state legislator or a member of Congress, and the things that are on their plate are so widespread and so vast. And I think there's comfort then in them in the familiar and moving ahead with the status quo. And so I think even the planner armed with the best stuff with this might not be able to get past and do a policy change or changing road design standards or something without the elected officials grasping that. I mean, we even run into planning and zoning officials that are, appointed and sit on these boards. The closest they can get would be some training, and all they get is training in public meeting laws. They don't really get training or sent to conferences or things to learn about this. So they're still just plodding along in the same status quo.
My answer is going to be very different. My answer of what I need, an open damn mind. I want people, and this may sometimes include myself, by the way. I can't sit there and go out and just say, oh, no, I know all the answers. Absolutely not. The day you stop learning is the day you should hang it up. But have an open mind. Be willing to have a discussion about how things can change, and it doesn't always have to be dramatic changes, but ultimately can be a better result. Because if a community just comes in, or you come into a community or whatever, and then it's this, let's just nibble around the edges and little tweaks. Well, Einstein said it best, right? About the whole idea of just doing things over and over again, and that's the truth. So I would hope that having good, honest discussion, if it's possible, if we can let our guard down just a little bit, and hear what one another is saying, and learn from each other, that I think some good things can happen. And that doesn't mean every city needs to look the same in a dramatically different, way, but contextually, I think be you, but be the best version of you. And sometimes that means having an open mind in getting us to that place. So maybe that's a little too deep in the woods, man. We're getting philosophical now with an engineer, buddy.
Yeah, well, French engineer, philosophy too.
I
Well,
love
but
it.
that's very interesting, right? And by the way, I do think that the engineering community is changing. I've seen a huge shift in the past 15 years. So I'm very hopeful. I tend to tell people that I'm incredibly thrilled to be in this profession right now. So whether it's engineering planning right now, because we're going to have to redefine everything, right? The way that cities were planned uh, completely changed in the 1900s, early 1900s, right? Late 1800s, and everything in 1900s. Same thing with engineering, all those systems were really defined how they work in the 1900s, 1950s with the DOTs and everything. And now we have to reinvent everything. So I always think about Paris 1920s with all those artists. You think it was a fun time to be with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and all those people. I don't think it was a fun time, but it was a very disruptive time or uncomfortable time. But that's what led to the incredible things that they did. And I think that at least ourselves, asking ourselves those questions and being open-minded to try to answer them in novel ways is going to lead us there. So I'm hopeful, despite
Yeah.
I'm
I
very
love it.
hopeful.
I
love
think
it.
we would all agree. You also project something, especially coming from where you are on the engineering side, that Chris has said for a long time, and that is engineers could do better with the humanities.
Yeah.
And planners could do better with the technical. And ironically, being a UIC graduate, and I didn't know this when I was there, but when I came out in the profession, I had really a hybrid master's degree because it was in urban planning, but with transportation. And half of our classes were over in the School of Engineering. So when I came out and was a practitioner at a highway agency, I felt over time and realized I was much more armed with the technical side of stuff, even as a planner, that made my understanding and arguments better. And I have come to appreciate that hybridization because of that and think that could happen. And I think it is happening, like you said, in more ways. So that's kind of a testament and advertisement for UIC.
I was just gonna say, if the good folks in Chicago hear this episode, we can be had for, here's a check. We'll give you the PO box for this 60-minute long discussion. Well, I knew this episode would be something very different, and I hope for our listeners it has certainly piqued your curiosity. Certainly, we'll post, but go check out, Sybil Derrible's even just his website or the page at the University of Illinois, Chicago, lots of good stuff there. All kinds. We talked about some of the things that you have coming out and the things that you've done recently. We'll post those as well. But man, just a great discussion, and I'm super honored that you've taken time to join us. But the time has come where I think now we need to grill you on nonsensical questions and maybe get out of the pontificating a little bit with our lightning round. So we'll do that now for the next 5 minutes or so. I want to ask you a quick couple questions. What is a stereotype Americans have of the French that you hate?
That we
Any-
surrender. That we surrender. I hate that. You have no idea how much I hate that because you have no idea how similar French people and American people are.
Yeah.
That fight about freedom and not being happy about stuff. I mean, that's the same root. So if you say French people surrender all the time, then American people surrender all the time because we're too similar. I can tell you that.
Oh, that's not the thought I would have. I thought it might have been something else, but man, that touched a nerve. I like it. That's good. Okay, fair enough. You hear that, Americans? The French did not surrender. Let's
They
get
cut the
that
heads
straight.
off their leaders. We didn't do that. I mean, come on, that's a boldness right there.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, my other question is, what's your favorite Seinfeld episode
Oh,
then?
took mine.
You're a big fan. What was the one as a youth learning English? And I love, by the way, I'll let you think about that, but you have heard this story that a lot of folks who did not or didn't grow up, understanding, knowing English, watched Friends as the show that learned, but yours is it's in that same sequence of Thursday nights that was aired here in the States, but different show. So what's your favorite all-time episode?
I don't know. I don't know. I have too many, and I watch them again, and they're all good. They're all
Yeah.
really, really good. I don't. If I had to name one, I find the Jimmy very, very funny. The Jimmy's when Kramer has its weird shoes and everything. So yeah.
My problem with it is just because there's the three themes within an episode, I will remember themes that I like, but I will forget the exact episode it's tied with in the other ways, and I will screw those up. So you're at UIC. I spent a couple of years there and other years living in Chicago. You're walking across Halsted Street. You're going to Jim's Original the greasy spoon at the corner that's been running the grilled onions 24/7 for 40 years? You getting the Maxwell Street Polish sausage, or are you getting the pork chop sandwich?
Oh, oh, I think the sausage. I gotta go with something more. I gotta go with sausage. Yeah.
Now, if you know people that do opt for the pork chop sandwich, it still has the bone in it. And my friend James, I did not make him known about that the time I took him to Jim's, and he bit in that and probably needed to go to a dentist. But yeah, that Polish sausage will stick with you for a while. I had a summer where I accidentally left half of one in the back seat of my car, and in Chicago, parked it for a couple of weeks, and I wasn't driving it, and it took a while to get that smell out of there.
So staying on the food topic though, I am curious more with you because you have a very unique hometown and you said a French culture, but geographically further away. What is the favorite, or maybe unique food that if you had from your hometown that you would share that says, oh, you all have to try this thing?
Oh, I'll tell you exactly what, and I'll tell you many of you can actually try it. It's a berry. It's an orange, like flashy orange berry. You only get it where I'm from in Newfoundland and then maybe Scandinavia. Very few places have it. It's called cloudberry. So you can even Google it, cloudberry, one word. It's orange. And if you want to see what it tastes like, and it's really odd, you can get it at IKEA because they actually sell cloudberry jam. So if you have an IKEA near you, I recommend you go and look for cloudberry jam. Really weird taste, great with ice cream, but I highly recommend it.
So when you were living there and growing up, and I'm guessing you're reliant upon Newfoundland for getting over there for transport and stuff. What was the process like with passports and customs and all of that, or was there some special designation?
No, passports, everything, man, the usual.
Huh.
Yeah, we don't get any privilege. Maybe in the old days we did, but not anymore. Of course, not American, so by showing my American passport, it's actually way easier now for me than for my before for the people who are still on the island.
What's the best/worst thing growing up on an archipelago?
Oh, so I always say the best is when you're a kid because you can just go out in the street, nothing's going to happen to you. No one locks their doors. It's absolutely amazing. The worst thing is being a teenager because you want to
nothing ever happens to you.
You want to do things. Well, yeah, exactly. Nothing happens to you, and you really want to do things, and I don't know, and you just can't. You have to hide, and yeah. So that's the worst thing is being a teenager, I think, for me anyway.
All right. So one last one for me. Where is a place that you visited? Maybe it was a vacation or through your work that really changed your perspective on things, on life.
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite place in the whole world still now is the Cheonggyecheon River in Seoul. So if you go to Seoul in South Korea, you go there, and there used to be a double-story expressway built in the 1970s because it's after the war. Seoul was expanding. We had to make way for the future, and the future was the car. So they built a double-story expressway, really similar to Boston. Right at the beginning, it was congested, it was polluted, it smelled bad. And in the 1990s, they decided to tear it down. And they tore it down, and they restored the stream that was there before, but it's below the ground. And so it's a linear park. When you go there, you don't hear the noise of the streets or anything. It's absolutely wonderful. You go there, talk about social fabric. You go there on Saturday or Sunday, it's full with families. And then if it rains, however, they tell you to leave because then they flood the place. So all the stormwater in the area just goes there. So with my wife, we always go there. I've been to Seoul a couple of times. So we would always go there. We'd get one of those, so either soju or makgeolli, like one of those drink from Korea. Just be there in the evening, just by the stream, maybe our feet in the stream, and just talk. And that's my favorite place, I think, in the whole world.
Sounds like a good remote place for us to do an episode from.
Yeah,
Figure that
right.
I'll join you for that one. I'll join you.
There you go. All right. Well, man, what an episode about those planning models with Professor Sybil Derrible, University of Illinois, Chicago. Sybil, thank you so very much for spending your time with us. This has been a really great discussion and one we really appreciate. So thank you.
I'm honored. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. So to our audience, one last time, head on over to the website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. Like, subscribe, and send us an email. To my fellow commissioners, can I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Wonderful. Thank you both. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. We appreciate everything you've done, and we'll keep doing our thing. Thank you. Hey everybody, Commissioner Danley here. Would you like to see more? Hear more? Well, we got you covered. Go to our website, www.theplanningcommissionpodcast.com. It's got everything you want. Guests, yep, past episodes, video, the audio, even our whiskey pairing, links to everything about all the people we've had on, books, websites, you name it. It's unbelievable. You want to reach out to us? Please. We'd be more than happy to chat. You can email us, planningcommissionpodcast@gmail.com. You want to tweet at us? Go for it, @planningcommish. We're also on YouTube with the Planning Commission Podcast channel, Facebook. Heck, send us a carrier pigeon if you need to. We'd love to hear from you about ideas, guests, you name it. Thank you for listening. We appreciate it. We'll keep doing our thing. You keep doing yours. Have a good one.